assessment that's being undertaken to help inform the next steps in potentially updating our official plan. My name is Carl Granke. I'm the town senior planner, and with me this evening in the planning department is Planner 1 Richard Grant. Councillors Jennifer Miller and Peter McKenna are also joining us this evening as well. This meeting and this study are an important milestone as we look at our official plan and envision how we want to see the town develop over the next 25 years. The official plan outlines council's vision for the development, how it's going to unfold, where council wants to see it, and what it looks like. The current official plan was approved in 2014 and projected a total of around 500 housing units between them and the end of the plan horizon in 2034. And right now in 2023, we're basically there. So at this point, we've identified the need to proceed with a land need study to forecast what we expect to see in the next over the next planning horizon, and that's going to help inform some important decisions that council is going to need to make about development. So I'm very pleased to be able to introduce to you Hannah Deltrop and Anthony Lorius from Dillon Consultants. We've been working on this project with Dillon since last year and are pleased to welcome them to this meeting to present their findings, projections, and present some discussion on the next steps. And Dillon will be guiding that discussion following their presentation. So if you're ready, Hannah, for to load the PowerPoint presentation, please go ahead.
Thanks very much for that introduction, Carl. Indeed, my name is Hannah Deltrop, so thanks for getting the introductions going. I'm from Dillon Consulting, and I'll introduce my co-patriots here in a moment. But thank you for joining us for this Public Information Center, a key part of getting feedback for our a key part of getting feedback to finalize the land needs analysis. So we're really excited to be with you guys today. Let me just make sure it's all gonna load up there. Oh, I'm not seeing the, oh, there we go. Okay, there are slide adoptions. What's ever going on there? So the purpose of our Public Information Center tonight is to review the preliminary results of the land needs analysis, otherwise known as the LNA for short. We're also keen to share the approach taken to the assessment with you, and we hope to achieve gathering feedback and commentary on the approach, as well as the key policy directions, and address any questions you may have. At any point, if you can't see what's on my screen, or if you're having trouble hearing me, please just let me know. So tonight we're going to go over a little bit more of the introduction. We'll talk about what has actually gone into creating the land needs analysis. We'll address the addendum at the beginning of the land needs analysis, so canopies closure and consolidation. We'll talk about the growth forecast, or Tom McCormack here will talk about the growth forecast, the residential land needs, industrial land needs, institutional land needs, commercial land needs. Observations and policy directions will all be delivered to you by Anthony Lorius, and then we'll address the next steps in the project. So as I alluded to, we are joined tonight by Anthony Lorius, who's a senior planner and land economist at Dillon Consulting. Myself, I'm a planner at Dillon Consulting, and Tom McCormack, our economist, without whom this project could not have happened. So thank you so much, Tom.
My pleasure.
And I'm trying to go to the next slide. Oh. One moment, please. It is reloading. It has a mind of its own tonight. Okay, we'll just get back to right where we were. And share our screen. Okay. So I hope you can see that. Is that all good?
Yes.
I can see that. Yep.
Okay, awesome. Anton, you take it away.
Okay. Thanks, Hannah. Yeah, I think we're seeing the vagaries of work from home and the evolution of new hybrid working environments. So thanks everyone for their patience on this. So what we've done is put together a presentation that sort of summarizes and tracks the structure of the report, which was circulated a little while ago and made public. And so a more detailed discussion of all the points we're going through today are in that report. So hopefully I'll be able to take you through that in a summary fashion. And at the end, we will take questions as best we can and get your feedback, as Hannah had mentioned, on some of the conclusions and the approach and the policy directions that arose from that. So just very quickly, in terms of a land need analysis, the land needs analysis is sort of one element of long-range planning and growth management strategy for municipalities in Ontario, at least. And essentially, it is an assessment based on various inputs to determine the amount of new urban lands, if any, that's required to accommodate growth over a particular planning horizon, which in our case is out to 2046. So the main elements of the LNA are shown up on the screen there, and they include the intensification target, which in the current LP is 25% of new units within sort of roughly the existing built up area. We have the greenfield residential land, which is the location of most new ground related housing growth, not necessarily all housing growth, but most new ground related housing growth, which is single and semi-detached and row house units. Greenfield employment, which is often referred to as industrial land or employment areas in the growth plan for the Greater Golden Horseshoe. But these are areas that are designated for predominantly industrial type use, but they actually accommodate a very wide range of economic uses. We have commercial land needs, both in existing areas like the downtown and in new areas, residential areas and community areas or expansion areas as well. And then a small amount of institutional lands, which also can exist in existing and new areas. And so together, those are all wrapped up into the LNA, and those are sort of the main buckets of conclusions that we've reached through the analysis that we've undertaken. So if we can go to the next slide. Let me just minimize this here. The land need analysis from a structural perspective really has 5 main pieces. There's a forecast of growth, population, employment, and household growth, which was prepared by Metro Economics, and as Hannah noted, forms the basis for the land need analysis. The next step is to undertake a review of the land supply, which is based on information provided by planning staff to determine the capacity to accommodate housing and employment growth over the period to 2046. Demand to accommodate the jobs in the housing is estimated by applying density factors to the growth forecast based on the current market and policy directions, which we'll talk about a little, the mix of housing and the forecast of growth by economic sector that Metro Economics again has put together. Step 4 is a reconciliation of demand and supply. We compare how much land is required to how much land is currently designated, and we reach conclusions on the need for additional urban lands. And then, of course, in doing all that analysis and looking at the market and the policy, some directions arise in terms of some of the big strategy issues that the municipality might want to consider as they look forward to a possible OP review. So we can just flip to the next slide. Obviously, there was somewhat of an unexpected event that occurred towards the end of the study process, which was the closure and consolidation of the Canopy cannabis facility at the old Hershey's plant. And we've included an addendum at the front end of the report to just acknowledge that this has happened, and also to sort of clarify our position, which is that really, in our view, since this is such a long-term process and we're talking about land needs assessment over a long period of time, really we are of the view that this doesn't materially affect the long-term outlook. The whole industry is restructuring. I'll let Tom speak a little bit to this in a moment, but really our view is that from an employment land perspective, at least, manufacturing is an interesting one. It's not expected to contribute significantly to job growth over the period, but there will be new building space added, and other sectors will contribute to that as well. We also know that the town is actively engaged in seeking a new tenant for the facility, which might not appeal to the full range of potential industrial demand because it's sort of more focused possibly on the agri-food sector. But we do know that active efforts are underway to fill that facility. But even if that facility may or may not get filled, the base economic assumptions under the forecast still apply. And so really it doesn't significantly change the results of the LNA. And I'm going to let Tom speak a little bit more to the forecast, maybe on the canopy issue, and then briefly on the forecast. But we'll see this when we get to the employment land supply. There is a wide range of uses that are expected for the future industrial land demand. So although this is an unfortunate event, and I don't think anyone really loves to see this kind of thing happen, from a longer range strategy and growth management perspective, we're of the view that it doesn't significantly change the results. So Tom, I don't know if you had any further thoughts on canopy, but maybe you could share them and talk briefly on the next slide about the growth forecast.
Okay, I'd be glad to. Thanks. My mic is on?
Yeah, I can hear you. Can everyone hear Tom?
I presume then everybody can, sure. Just waiting for the next slide. Okay, so I'm very optimistic about Smiths Falls' future, and that's because there are about 3 really good reasons why Smiths Falls is going to grow over the course of the next 25 years. The first item I'd like to raise is the age distribution of the population. The people who live in Smiths Falls today, relative to the people who live throughout Ontario as a whole, are relatively younger than they are. I'm sorry, they're relatively older than they are in the rest of the province. The chart on the bottom left-hand side shows the age distribution of Ontario's population in red, and the blue line shows Smiths Falls population. We're showing the percentage distribution of the total population by age. The youngsters are on the left-hand side, and as you progress by 5-year age groups to the right-hand side, we get to the point where we're talking about people who are, I believe, over the age of 100. So what we have are slightly more people in Smiths Falls who are over the age of about 50, let's say, and relatively less people under the age of 50. But there's a fairly significant bulge in about the age groups between 25 and 35. And what this particular comparison shows me is that, yes, there are a lot of people in Smiths Falls who are aging in place, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. But there's also the people who are young are really quite in the middle of their age groups that are family formation years. They need housing, they're raising kids, they need educations for those kids. And so they're providing a firm underpinning to the local economy. And this is a very positive thing. Now, the country as a whole faces a crisis because all of the boomers are retiring, or they will be over the course of the next 15 to 20 years. And yes, you have your share of boomers, maybe a little higher than most, but everywhere in the country, boomers are in relatively great supply. Now, because they're resigning, or because they are retiring gradually over the next 10 to 15 years, the federal government has stepped up its national immigration targets, and you've all read about this in the papers, I'm sure. And a lot of people are scratching their heads saying, why are we doing this? Well, we're doing it because if we don't, we won't have enough people to fill the jobs that they're retiring from. The bottom line is the boomers didn't replace themselves. We've had a total fertility rate of about 1.5 ever since the mid-60s. That means not every couple replaced themselves. So we're now having to find people to fill the jobs that the boomers are retiring from. That means a lot more immigration over the next few years. It's not just a phenomenon in Smiths Falls, it's a phenomenon right across the country. So there's going to be people moving from other parts of Ontario to Smiths Falls. They're going to be moving from other provinces to Smiths Falls, and they're going to be moving from other countries to Smiths Falls to take those jobs that are being vacated by baby boomers. That's going to drive up the population. The people who retire from those jobs aren't dying. They're just leaving the jobs, retiring, spending their money locally. So the population growth is going to increase because we have these folks coming in to replace them as they retire. So that's point number one. Point number two is the table in the middle, which shows you our decomposition of all the jobs that are in Smiths Falls provided by employers in by industry. And if you look at the bottom part of the chart, you've got 18 industries. The first data column shows you the number of jobs in each industry that are accounted for by what we call economic-based jobs, the ones that are driving the growth in the community. And the second column is all the jobs that are providing services to the local population. So it's the economic-based jobs that drive future growth in a community, or at least contributes to driving growth in the local community. Now, I've summarized in 6 or 7 groups at the top all the jobs by industry, so we have a better idea of what we're talking about here. And the bottom line is, as Anthony pointed out, we're concerned about the loss of jobs at Canopy. They're in the manufacturing sector, and that's of concern. But if you look at the chart on the right-hand side, which shows at the bottom, the blue bar is the number of jobs in industry, mostly manufacturing, over the course of the period from 2001 to 2021, and what we think is going to happen in the future. As you can see, manufacturing jobs have been disappearing in Smiths Falls for a long time, right up until about 2016 when Canopy came in. We briefly got an upturn in jobs, and now we've had a collapse in some of those jobs. Not all of them, some of them. This is of concern, but it's not undermining the economy of the area. It's of concern, but not undermining it, because tourism is a significant share of the economy. The jobs in tourism are represented in the chart by the green bar. Also, Smiths Falls happens to be a healthcare center for all of the communities surrounding Smiths Falls. And so the purple bar shows the number of jobs in the healthcare sector over the course of the last 20 years, and what we think is going to happen in the future. And then finally, there's a bunch of other jobs in education and other services that are also going to grow on the economic base side. So the bottom line is, yes, we're at about 2,500 economic based jobs today. We think that Smiths Falls will grow to about 3,200, 3,500 economic based jobs in the future. That's going to attract people to Smiths Falls to fill those jobs, over and above the people attracted to Smiths Falls to fill the jobs that the boomers are retiring from. So those 2 factors alone are going to be very, very important underpinnings to the future growth of Smiths Falls. So as I said at the beginning, I'm very optimistic for these real reasons. And in spite of what's happened to Canopy, I remind everybody, and I'm sure you don't need somebody from Burlington reminding you, that Smiths Falls has been through an awful lot of ups and downs, with major companies coming in, leaving, coming in, and leaving. So what's happened with Canopy is nothing new, and you folks are strong and respond to all this very, very well. So I thank you for your time. I'd be glad to answer any questions at the end of the full presentation. Anthony?
That's great. Thanks, Tom. So again, as I mentioned at the beginning, we have replicated the tables from the report, and we'll go through them in summary fashion. And hopefully I'll be able to give you an overview of how we've structured the analysis and the key assumptions. And of course, we're happy to discuss, and we're looking for your feedback. So on the residential side, the population, really it's about household growth for the structure of the LNA. The population forecast that Tom prepared is translated into a housing forecast to make a somewhat more complicated story short, based on the application of household formation rates to the forecast population. And then the housing mix, as we explained in the report, is based on sort of a 2-step process. The period to 2031 is based on the housing mix that's set out in the development charge background study. And then from 2031 to 2046, we have that mix shifting back to a bit higher proportion of ground-related housing, which is really going to be driven by some of the factors that Tom was talking about, especially demand for younger families, probably arising out of the Ottawa commuter shed, looking for affordable ground-related housing. So what that does over the whole period is it results in a forecast housing mix of about 55% singles and semis, 20% towns, and 25% apartments. And for some of the councillors in the group, you may notice that this is a bit of a higher density unit mix than is currently envisioned in the official plan. But that's because when we get to the supply, we'll see one of the unique features here for the analysis is that we have a significant number of higher density sort of row and apartment units in the mix, which at the time was driven by accommodating the labor force for Canopy. So in a way, Canopy closing and consolidating may have sort of accelerated the shift back to a more typical pattern of housing mix given the location within the metropolitan area. So if we can go to the next slide, Hannah. So we can see that on the supply side, the estimates of supply are based on information provided by town staff. As we explained in the report, we have specific unit counts. And thank you, Richard, for all of your hard work on this. We went through this a number of times. So the unit counts for applications in progress or units within active plans were provided by the town. There is a remnant greenfield site category to the supply, which are sort of like just the remaining pieces of greenfield supply throughout the community. And we have estimated their unit potential based on what we've seen happen in other communities. A portion of those developed, so we've estimated that. And you'll also see a line there for the adjustment of the housing unit supply potential to 2021. And that's because you always like to use the most recent information available. So all of the supply estimates were prepared by staff for the end of 2022. But of course, we're comparing that to a forecast that starts in mid-year 2021. So we have to add those units back into the supply because of course, those would not have been completed or they would have been under construction in the base census year. So that's what that line is for. And you can see that that process produces an overall supply of about 762 units. And the supply that goes into the analysis is just removing the single detached infill units within the targeted growth areas because the focus is on greenfield land needs. So we have to remove that small component of ground related housing that's located within sort of the identified intensification areas. You'll notice that the mix of the housing unit supply potential is somewhat different than the overall demand forecast, with a lot more towns and apartments in the mix and somewhat less in the way of singles and semis. So if we can go to the next slide. One of the interim steps that we need to take for this analysis, which is something that we also do for the work that we're doing for municipalities in the Greater Golden Horseshoe, which are of course subject to the growth plan requirements for minimum intensification targets, is to adjust the forecast to account for the town's intensification target, which is 25% of units within existing areas. And the way we have to do that, we have to adjust the mix because we can't just allocate a market demand to inside the built up area because there's just not enough ground related housing supply to accommodate what would otherwise be a market forecast. So what we do is we set a typical housing mix for inside the targeted growth areas, which in an intensification environment is going to be mostly apartments and row houses. And then we have sort of a more standard greenfield housing mix for the new residential areas, which is proportionally more ground related with singles and semis and somewhat less apartments, because those, of course, you don't want all of those in the greenfield area because they would, of course, be competing with your intensification potential. So when we apply those shares, the housing mix by area to the total forecast, we have what we've shown as an adjusted townwide housing growth by type, which really just shifts a few units out of the ground related category and into apartments and rows to better reflect the current OP policy to accommodate a specific share of units inside the built boundary. So that adjusted forecast is shown in the table to your right. And you can see that it's not a huge shift, but it's important to account for that because it is a current official plan policy. And at the bottom row there, you'll see that it results in a housing unit mix that reduces the single and semi share by about 5% and then increases it by 3% and 2% on the town and the apartment side in total. The forecast overall remains at 1,380 units. We've just sort of adjusted the mix of housing to better reflect the town's intensification policy. If we can go to the next slide. And then the next step is the reconciliation of supply and demand. And you can see from the table, and we explain in the report that When you compare the greenfield demand to supply, we see a shortage for the single and semi-detached category, a shortage for townhouses, and an ample supply of apartment units to accommodate demand. Now, if we were just to take this forward and say, well, we're going to plan some new greenfield areas based just on the single and semi in town requirement, we would be missing a component of that. We wouldn't necessarily be planning for, the full range of housing. So because we happen to have a slight oversupply of apartments in the existing supply, we make what we've called the complete community adjustment for apartments, which is adding approximately 50 apartment units, which has the effect of raising that to about 10% of the total. That results in a total forecast for the greenfield area of about 521 units, which is mostly ground related. We get to a land need by applying the density factors that are currently shown in the OP, which are roughly 24 units per net hectare on the single and semi side, 50 units per net hectare on the town side, and 140 units per net hectare on the apartment side, which all draws down to a net land need of roughly 19 hectares. And that when we talk about net density, that really is just the area of the house and the building lot. It doesn't include roads and open space, commercial institutional uses. And so that's all captured in what we call the net to gross ratio, which for most communities is about 50% of the new lands that's required. So when you apply that 50% rate to the net land need of about 18 hectares, we get roughly 37 hectares of gross developable land needs. And that translates into, say, just under 100 acres of buildable residential land. And again, that doesn't include any natural heritage features that would have to be netted out. So depending on where the location of that residential land is ultimately determined, the designation may need to be somewhat more than that 92.9 that we've shown to actually get that amount of buildable area. So that's the residential side. Hannah, if we can go quickly to, I think it's the employment side. Tom talked a little about the economic base and more of the population serving stuff. And that's generally the approach that we take to estimating demand for industrial land. The first step is to undertake a forecast of job growth on sectors that typically locate on industrial land, which is referred to often as employment land or employment areas in some of the provincial literature. And, contrary to popular perception, the most employment areas across Southern Ontario accommodate a wide range of economic activities. It's not just manufacturing, it's a range of core industrial, professional and business services, education and health, and other population serving activities. If you just imagine some of the employment areas that you've run through or driven through elsewhere in Ontario, there are, in some cases, there are office buildings, which we don't think we're going to see a lot of growth here in Smiths Falls, but there are manufacturing facilities, there's warehousing and distribution, there's some quasi-retail, you have your furniture stores, maybe the coffee shop or the Tim's on the corner. So in terms of modern employment uses, they tend to be sort of across a wide range of spectrum. When you look at, say, the employment surveys of any of the larger Southern Ontario municipalities, most people are just amazed to see the sectoral distribution on employment areas. Not only is manufacturing not the only category, it's often not the largest. The largest in some places can be professional and business services, some of the retail uses. So we've made that estimate in the chart to the right, and we explain it in a bit more detail in the report. At a high level, based on a distribution of sort of employment by shares, we're showing a total forecast of employment on employment land, which is mainly industrial type jobs, of about 420 jobs over the period to 2046. So the next step is then to compare that to the amount of land that's designated to accommodate that growth. And Hannah, if we can just go there quickly. This is also based on information provided by town staff, and we've provided quite a bit of detail in the report and in the table that's reproduced to the right. And you can see that we have a lot of numbers in this table, but really the conclusion to be drawn here is that there's very little in the way of available land supply. We estimate that the current occupied supply, which is the total minus the total vacant, is roughly 79.5 net hectares, which is at the bottom of the table. And that is basically fully developed. We've estimated 91% occupancy rate. And for most large employment areas in Southern Ontario, once you're up over 90% developed, it is essentially full, and you don't really have that range and flexibility and choice in operating site size. based on a quick estimate of the jobs on employment land based on the 2021 census employment by sector, at a very high level, it looks like the current density is somewhere around 24 jobs per net hectare, but we would probably need to dig into that a little bit more to get a more sort of accurate measure of that, because the census information for census tracts is sort of like half overlapping, and it sort of gets in there, but it doesn't really get to the number like other municipalities that undertake employment surveys, for example. But it's a number that makes sense, and it's sort of in range with what we see for standard industrial densities, which are in the range of, say, 37 and a half jobs per net hectare, and somewhat higher than what we see with areas, say, for example, along the 401 corridor that are more focused on goods movement uses that can be, as low as 8 to 10 jobs per net hectare. Typically, we see the warehousing and distribution sector at low densities, but it's not always the case. As a bit of an aside, I'm always amazed at how dense some of the new Amazon facilities are. I think the one in Hamilton, for example, is up around 50 or 60 jobs per net hectare. So it's not always the case, but typically the warehousing and distribution sector tends to be at lower densities, and it requires more land. So that is why in the report, and if we can just go to the next slide, we have estimated the demand according to a range, just to give some flexibility, because as we'll talk about in a bit, the real issue with the employment land side here is not so much the specific estimate, but more so that there just isn't any. So notwithstanding what the forecast may or may not be, there is no opportunity to accommodate that demand. So if we take a look at the forecast growth of 420 jobs, and there's a little typo there on the report, which we can fix later, at a standard density of 37 and a half, the shortage is minimal. One might argue that it's relatively balanced, but again, then you're not maintaining any ability to accommodate new jobs over time. At a lower density of 20 jobs per hectare, which is sort of more focused on warehousing and distribution, that 8 to 10 jobs per hectare, that's just for pure warehousing and distribution use. And you don't find a lot of areas that are only this type of use. Again, it tends to be a range of uses, but we do see for areas that tend to be more focused on the goods movement side of things, densities around 20 jobs per hectare. And that gives us a range of demand of about, say, 10 to 20 net hectares. We've estimated the current market supply at about 8 hectares, which gives us a range of between 3 and 13 net hectares of demand for employment land, which would be roughly 16 hectares, or say 40 acres when we incorporate a net to gross factor of 80% to account for roads and swim factors. But again, the big issue here really is just that there is basically no land supply left. If a major user were to come to town and needed 10 or 12 or 15 acres of service land, it would be very difficult to accommodate that demand quick enough to maybe prevent them from going to another location. So the key strategic issue, as we've identified, really is just a lack of any lands for investment attraction in manufacturing or logistics, or some of the other sectors like professional services that tend to locate on employment land. So if we can just go to the next slide. We've also undertaken a high level of the institutional land need based on the forecast by sector prepared by Metro Economics, and we've shown that to the right in the table. When you take a look at the forecast for the typical sectors that we consider to be part of institutional, which is education, health and social services, government and public administration, and the culture sector generally, we wind up with a total growth of about 756 jobs. We have to remove from that some of the institutional jobs that tend to be found in new industrial areas, and that's healthcare, it's dentists, it's chiropractic facilities, it's some of the smaller scale clinics that we see throughout those types of areas. That gives us an overall growth of about 650 jobs, and at a standard sort of based on our experience density of 32 jobs per gross hectare, which includes the net to gross adjustment, and a small adjustment for vacancy, which we'll talk a little bit more about when we get to the commercial side of things within the existing stock. We wind up with a total demand of about 20 hectares, some of which is to be accommodated by lands, as we understand, to be recently rezoned to accommodate a long-term care facility, which leaves a remaining institutional land demand to 2046 of about 14 hectares. And so one of the policy directions that arises out of this analysis is a need potentially to assess some options for accommodating the remaining demand for institutional lands. some of the demand for institutional lands will be included in that net to gross adjustment and sort of just generally occurs through the normal course of secondary planning, but that may or may not be enough to accommodate the full demand. There may be opportunities to accommodate some smaller scale institutional uses in other parts of the community, particularly in the commercial land supply, which, if we can go to the next slide, looks to be in pretty healthy supply. So for the commercial land analysis, we have relied on the work that was prepared by Urban Metrics a few years ago. And in their report, they have, and we've reviewed the analysis, and I know many of the people at the Urban Metrics shop, and they're great folks and they're competent, and we work with them often. So I have a high level of comfort adopting their work. They have identified a total vacant supply of just over 65 acres, and they've estimated a demand out to 2030 for about 7 acres of land, and then over the longer term to 2046, about 18 acres of land. And the way they've done that is through a per capita space factor and a standard retail coverage of, I think they use 25%. But really, the demand is relatively modest, consistent with sort of the overall context for the forecast, which would suggest a surplus of, say, 50 acres or 19 hectares to 2046. I think it's important, though, that these numbers kind of have to be viewed with some flexibility because the analysis itself is a couple of years old. I understand that some issues have emerged more recently in terms of the availability of smaller spaces and some challenges with re-tenanting the bigger spaces. So those answers in terms of the surplus could change if a major new retailer came to town or if some other economic factor changed. But based on the Urban Metrics analysis, which appears to be very well done, there does appear to be an ample supply of commercial space, which gives rise to a few of the policy directions that we talk about later, and which I'll get to after we just go through the next slide. So very quickly to recap, based on the analysis that we have undertaken with the housing mix and the forecast that Tom prepared, we're looking at a need for roughly 37 gross hectares of new residential lands, which is just under 100 acres, up to 16 gross hectares of employment land, which is roughly 40 acres, 13.7 gross hectares of institutional lands, which would be sort of in the range of 30 acres. And then on the commercial side, there does appear to be a fairly ample supply of lands, which again gives rise to some of the observations that we have on, I think this is the last slide before we get to next steps. So arising out of the LNA, it would appear that an expansion of the urban boundary is required. That needs to be subject to more detailed analysis going forward as part of the broader OP review. There is a recommendation and a direction coming out of the commercial land needs analysis that maybe there's an opportunity to use some of that commercial supply to accommodate more residential use. We've also identified as a possible direction that the town consider a more formal delineation of the targeted growth areas to better focus the intensification efforts. And we're not suggesting that intensification be planned for over and above greenfield or in place of greenfield demand. They're two markets. The ability of most municipalities to accommodate greenfield housing is totally to do with the supply. If you have the supply, you get the houses. If you don't have the supply, they go to the community down the road. Whereas intensification is more about market appeal. In order to get more intensification, more people have to want to buy those units. More people have to want to live in the mid-rise or the stacked towns. And so our view is that sort of a bit more detailed look at the range of the potential intensification site might better inform how the town could focus market demand, maybe taking another look at the density targets and height relative to, say, the market potential of various areas and some of the local market conditions as they have evolved since, at least the commercial market study was undertaken. On the employment land, the big issue is that there's just, you probably need a new industrial park, some new sort of business park area, and there are a number of directions that could take. Again, the growth forecast itself is relatively sort of modest. So the numbers themselves, I wouldn't say show the need for a huge employment area, but it's probably an issue that needs to be given a bit more consideration in terms of phasing or identifying, the suitability of potential sites, a dedicated area, that might be phased out, maybe looking at some post-period designations that, you know, we wouldn't service it all at once. But the big issue is that consideration really should be given to options for providing a new business park, really from an investment attraction perspective. We've also identified you know, possibly an opportunity here to undertake an employment survey like some of the other larger municipalities in Ontario do, to help in that decision making, to keep track of the real estate needs of large and hopefully growing employers, or what's coming to the community from other places in Ontario and around the world, as Tom had indicated before. And maybe taking a look at the institutional policies to determine the specific approach to be taken in the new OP. There are lots of opportunities. A proportion of the institutional land needs would definitely be accommodated through the normal course of secondary planning for new communities, such as they may be, but there may also be opportunities and synergies to accommodate some of those smaller scale institutional uses into some of the new community areas for which an ample supply has been identified. So on that, we certainly seem to agree with the Urban Metrics approach that some strategy to address the surplus commercial space might be included. And this is also something that would certainly need to be subject to more detailed analysis, but it could include, you know, mixed use in neighborhood serving commercial sites, addressing the downtown vacancy and the challenge with smaller unit availability, considering options for institutional. And Carl, this is the change that we didn't quite have a chance to make. So I'm not sure we have this last point quite right, but really it speaks to the broader notion that there is a fairly substantial amount of commercial supply, and there may be opportunities to accommodate mixed residential and commercial uses to be more transit supportive and to accommodate demand for higher density living and advance a broad range of other planning goals related to intensification. But that, of course, would need to be subject to more detailed analysis, and this is all pointed towards the work that would be undertaken in the next stages of this in a potential OP review. So we can wrap it up and go to the final slide, Hannah. For this work, the next steps are to hopefully get some questions and feedback on the approach and the results that we have summarized here. That'll be wrapped up into a second draft report to be reviewed by staff, presented to the Committee of the Whole, including some conceptual mapping options on what the directions might be as part of an OP review for new urban designations, and then submit the finalized report. Then, of course, following that, the results of the final LNA results would be approved by council and used as an input to the upcoming potential review of the official plan, along with all the other studies that also need to be undertaken. It's probably important to reiterate that the land needs side of the equation, although it does tend to get the most media attention, as you might have noticed recently with Bill 23 and the like, there are, you know, there's a whole suite of work that has to be done to update the official plan. So really it's an important part, but this is just one element of the work that will need to be done going forward. So hopefully that has been helpful, and I'd be happy to answer questions that you may have on any of what we've talked about today. Thanks very much for having us.
Thank you, Anthony. So if we can close the presentation, just so I can see everybody's screens, we'll open the floor to any questions or discussions that folks may have for our consultants or for town staff. I see Jennifer.
Thank you so much. And thanks, Anthony, for your presentation tonight. You and your team did a lot of great work, so I really appreciate that. I think probably we're quiet because we're all trying to absorb everything that was said. And I'm wondering a little bit, as I try to absorb it, about your job numbers and how we would compare to other rural communities with those. They seem very low to me. And so I'm just wondering if you have any further comment on that.
I think that I might ask my esteemed colleague Tom to take a swing at that. Yeah, but yeah, overall the growth context here, like there are a lot of factors that go into it, and I won't steal Tom's number, but I think it's safe to say that you are not unlike other rural communities in which the overall growth context is sort of towards the modest side. But there are factors that could change that, and this is why we do 5-year reviews. So Tom, I don't know if you had anything else on that.
Well, I guess because I've done so many of these in other locations right across the country, I'm a little surprised at your modesty, because I think the numbers you've got are pretty strong for a community of your size. I forgot to mention when I was talking about the things that are driving the job growth and the residential workers growth in Smiths Falls, I forgot to mention about the commuting opportunities that we have as well. They go to Perth, they go to Ottawa. There's just all kinds of places nearby that people commute to but live in Smiths Falls. And every time somebody moves to Smiths Falls, it means there's more need for community-based services, and that means more jobs pile up in the local community because you got more population growth. So when I look at the numbers that you have, and I think about the other communities that I've done, I think most other communities would be envious of what your future holds compared to what their futures hold. I mean, it's really hard when you are what you consider to be a rural community, when you're a very isolated rural community, and the only thing you've got going for you is what you've got in your community. And you folks have that in spades, but you also have all these nearby opportunities. So people are commuting to other communities. They're choosing Smiths Falls as a place of retirement because they lived close by for 30, 40, 50 years and really like the environment, but don't want to be in the big city anymore. So, that, again, I can't say strongly enough that you should not feel that you are facing very modest growth. I mean, it's really quite significant.
Thank you. That's encouraging. Appreciate that.
Good.
And, notwithstanding recent events, we don't need to look too far back in history to see, how significant an impact a major employer can have on the growth trajectory of smaller communities, which, sort of highlights the importance of the industrial land supply community and making sure that there's an opportunity to accommodate that demand should it want to, put itself down in Smiths Falls.
Go ahead, Chris.
Yeah, Carl, thank you very much. I'm a little what I've seen tonight for sure. As the largest commercial and residential landlord in Smith Falls and developer in Smith Falls, I'm very discouraged on what I heard tonight. So I'm going to there's 300 and some apartments under construction right now, and we need 400 or whatever the number is over the next 25 years. That scares the shit out of me, quite frankly. I own the Settlers Ridge Center, and it's got like a 40% occupancy right now. I agree with you that commercial is a problem in Smith Falls, and I'm not quite as optimistic as Tom is, I guess, because with we had 2,000 jobs when Canopy was in full operation here, and now we're down to, let's say, 200. I'm going to be holding back on any future development from especially apartment buildings in Smith Falls. So I appreciate what you had to say tonight, but I'm a little skeptical, quite frankly. So.
Carl, I'll just jump in here. Thanks very much for the presentation. It was certainly insightful. I was a little surprised at the numbers, the employment numbers per hectare in employment or institutional lands. Is that number, is there a trend there? Is it going down? Are you seeing a trend over the last, 5 to 10 years in those numbers dropping? They seemed low to me, save and except for the Amazon example that you gave, but generally they seem pretty low. Is that a trend with automation in the industrial operations?
Yeah, just you said institutional in there as well. Or is the question about industrial? Just to clarify,
It's industrial.
Yeah. The trend, it's an interesting one. The trend is generally towards lower densities, and it's driven by a lot of factors. Lots of warehousing and distribution, automation in the manufacturing sector, which is great for productivity. It just happens to wind up being, more jobs being taken by robots as opposed to workers. So, however, that does not mean that no new manufacturing space will be built. We're seeing sort of a minor resurgence as a result of the COVID pandemic and the reshoring. And I think there's an interest generally in bringing supply chains home. But what we see is that while we do have new manufacturing space being added, so there's new land and building space being added, we don't really see the job growth accommodated with that because it's a lot of automation, it's a lot of robots, and what you also see is decline in other parts of the base. So the new jobs that we get are offset, unfortunately, in a cyclical fashion by things like the closure of Canopy and their older manufacturing uses in Smiths Falls. And those are sort of the uses that sort of get recycled into other things like self-storage facilities. But the space, there still will be demand for space, although it doesn't necessarily show up in the job numbers. And one of the topics that I've always been very interested about is, why do we focus always on employment density? Because, it's one of the funny things about industrial land. It's not like residential. Like I can look at 175 single detached homes and I can tell you basically what's going on in every single one of them on averages. You can't say the same for industrial. You can have 3 industrial buildings. One of them is Amazon at 60 jobs per hectare. One of them is Fluke Transport that's got 4 people working there and a security guard. And then the third one is, a mix of furniture, retail, and manufacturing and some small office space on top. So it tends to be, complex and unique to the communities that are involved. But the standard industrial density of 37.5 jobs per net hectare, that's been sort of the case for quite a while. And then the variability that you see in that really has to do with how much warehousing and distribution, or on the planning side, how much commercial or accessory retail uses you allow in employment areas. And that's a whole other discussion that we don't necessarily need to get into now. That's probably better for the next stage of the analysis. But yes, the short answer is yes, densities are trending down.
It's an important metric as we strive to fill vacant industrial spaces like the Canopy facility. And I think it probably tempers our expectations when it comes to the number of people, workforce, requirements to support businesses. So it's great insight. Thank you.
So I'll just ask a question based on certainly what I've been seeing in the last couple of years is we've seen a significant influx and a lot of our rural neighbors have as well of residents who are residents who are no longer tethered to a big city or jobs where they have to commute 5 days a week, and that that's given people opportunities, has given people options, and our job as a town is to continue to make Smith Falls a very attractive place for those folks who have a little bit more flexibility on where they can relocate. Do you see the impacts that with COVID and increased remote work and that, do you see what sort of impact do you see over the longer term in terms of the assessment and the metrics that you've created to forecast this growth?
I'll start, and then maybe I'll ask Tom if he has some thoughts. I think it's going to come back a little. I mean, what we've seen in the data is that there was this initial surge of COVID related migration, and there's been a lot of good work done on communities that have absorbed a lot of that, and it even goes national. I mean, I think Hannah, probably you saw a big spike in COVID related property increases, but I think that this is going to temper over time. I sort of feel like it's gone up and it's come down, and it's going to kind of stabilize. And the short term pattern that we're seeing right now is we're actually seeing a bit of a return. People obviously are hoping, I think, for more of a return to work than will actually happen, but we're sort of operating on about a 2/3 or a 65% basis. Like, I think 65% of it is probably going to come back in the short term. The longer term trend, though, no question, is going to be driven by immigration. It's going to be driven by age structure. I mean, mostly it's going to be driven by growth in the Ottawa commuter shed, and it's going to be a lot of young families looking for homes. What's going to happen with Bill 23 and the land supply is sort of the subject of great debate, as I think we've all noticed. But there will certainly be a component of demand going forward that will be demographically driven. I expect some of the specific COVID-related impacts will moderate over time as the hybrid work environments evolve, and you might actually see more sort of apartment and condo development to some concerns that were expressed earlier in the downtown, closer to some of the amenities, which is where a lot of the hybrid workers are starting to show interest. At least in the Southern Ontario municipalities, the expectation is that downtown Toronto, for example, or downtown Ottawa, it'll eventually be fine. It's more the suburban centers. It's the old cube farms that might be in trouble here. And we're sort of seeing a little bit of that in Calgary and across Canada. But there is an expectation that the urban centers will sort of benefit a bit more from COVID necessarily than the ground related housing, which, notwithstanding this little correction that we're in now, is going to continue to be driven really by age structure and young families looking for affordable ground related housing.
Yeah, I would support all of that, Anthony, and I would add only that everybody seems to get the impression that we have a choice of either working at a place of work, or we have a choice of working at home. The bottom line is, most occupations, most industries, people can't do that. There's a very select few where working at home was an option. You know, the professional services, some medical, some education, but bottom line is, I think people are finding it's not the ideal solution, and I would agree with Anthony that we've had enough experimentation with it, and I think people are going to gradually move towards working at a place of work, and employers are going to want people to be at their places of work. It just works better. But we've had a good discussion here on Zoom, but we can't see all the faces. Not everybody's showing up the way we would hope. But the bottom line is, I think Anthony's right. It's just long term, I don't think things are going to change dramatically in the relationship of jobs and work. I mean, you could get some employers who say, I don't want to have my office in downtown Ottawa. Let's look for some places in suburban Ottawa or in Perth or in some of the locations around Ottawa to establish our operations. But even that's limited, because most of them like to be in clusters where they can deal with all the professional services they need and the marketing people and that kind of thing. So I support what Anthony said fully.
Thanks very much for your comment in the chat. We appreciate it.
Go ahead, Chris.
Carl, maybe the present council might want to revisit development charges. The only reason I put up 160 apartments in the last 2 years is because I got ahead of the development charges, saved myself $1.1 million. And I certainly would, at $7,000 an apartment, I will not be doing any more in town until that gets cleaned up. I'll be certainly visiting Kemptville and Brockville and Carleton Place instead of there. So I think we better maybe take a serious look at that.
Carl, I have to dash off, so I just want to thank the consulting team for the work and the report, and you've given us lots to consider. So thank you very much.
Thanks very much for coming. Welcome. We appreciate it.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
Yep.
So I think we've provided a fair amount of information here this evening, and certainly there's opportunity for feedback and discussion. So I think if we definitely would welcome any additional feedback or comments that anybody may have, either anyone as part of this call or anyone who's not part of this call. But my email address was provided on the presentation as well. So certainly, if within the next couple of weeks, if you have any additional feedback or comments on the information, please do reach out to me. Anthony, if there's any particular if there's any areas in particular that you'd like feedback or responses on, certainly I'd welcome that. I'd welcome that direction as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm a big fan of feedback. We obviously do our best to wrap it all up and consider all the angles and make sure that we've, wrestled all the issues to ground, so that when we tie it all up in an analysis, we get an answer that makes sense. So, but it does happen from time to time. You miss something, or there's a piece of information that you weren't aware of, or something changes. By all means, let us know, because our interest is in getting a solid piece of work in place here that can really help the town move forward with possibly an OP review and planning for success in the future. So yes, open to all input. It only makes the work better when you can triangulate these things.
Thank you, Merida, for the comment. So at this point, over the next couple of weeks, we'll welcome any additional submissions, comments, or suggestions with respect to either the methodology or the findings, and then we will be working with Dillon Consultants to update the report and the recommendations, and we'll be presenting to council for consideration. So again, what we saw this evening is not the final package. We will be looking for we will have that opportunity to have a look at everything. And once again, I'd like to thank everybody who has participated, signed in, and taken the time out of your evening to join us. And I'd like to also thank Dillon Consultants for the work that they've done and the presentation. Before I turn it over to Hannah, Anthony, and Tom for any last words, do we have any additional comments or submissions from anybody here in attendance? Okay, I guess seeing none, Anthony, Hannah, Tom, do you have any closing remarks and just a bit of a summary on some of the timing for the next steps, please?
I don't have any specific issues. I think maybe we should. I'd like to thank Richard again for all of his hard work on the supply. We spent a fair amount of time going through that and making sure we had it all considered. So we look forward to the review of the report. If you do have feedback, please share, because we're very much looking forward to getting it wrapped up and getting it in front of council, so we can get some direction moving forward, and then hopefully taking a look at what changes can be made to the OP to take things forward over the next 25 years.
No more comments at this end.
Thanks very much for having us, Carl.
Yeah, it was great.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you for the discussion. And once again, my email address, I'll just put that back up on. Sorry, could we just put my email address back up on screen, please, Hannah?
Sure. I actually also put it in the chat there, so folks should be able to find it in there if they can't, but I'll put it
So any additional correspondence can be sent directly to me, and certainly it's important to council that they have all of that feedback and information. So by all means, any additional feedback will be considered and reviewed. So thank you all, and enjoy the rest of your evening. Enjoy the spring.
Yes.
Let's hope so.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you for coming.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
I know.
Bye-bye. I'm still doing it.